The woods had no name on any map. Locals simply called them the Quiet Stretch, a place where the air hung heavy and the wind carried whispers instead of song. The trees grew too close together, their roots coiling like veins under a sickly green carpet of moss. At the forest's heart stood a single cabin, sunken into the soil as if the earth had been trying to swallow it for years. Its windows were black, its door barely holding to rusted hinges, and its walls, painted once in white, were now the color of dried bone. When the hikers found it, the air changed. It wasn't just cold, it was aware. Inside, a smell of decay clung to everything, thick, wet, and old. The walls were lined with photographs, dozens of them, showing faces that looked human only in fragments. Eyes too close together. Limbs too short. Mouths that stretched too wide. Generations of the same features repeating, twisting, and collapsing in on themselves. At the bottom of each frame, the same surname appeared again and again. One of the hikers, a woman named Claire, ran her fingers over a frame, brushing away years of dust. Beneath the grime, she saw her own eyes staring back at her. The same color. The same small scar above the brow. Her breath caught as the floorboards creaked, though no one had moved. Somewhere behind the walls, something shifted, softly at first, then louder, like crawling beneath wood. Outside, the trees began to whisper again. The forest was remembering her. And after 7 generations of silence, the bloodline was no longer content to stay buried. The discovery in the woods began like any other hiking trip, a group of 4 friends chasing a forgotten trail deep into the Appalachian wilderness. They weren't explorers or thrill-seekers, just weekend wanderers with a thirst for quiet. The deeper they moved into the forest, the more it seemed to swallow the world around them. Cell signals vanished. The sound of birds faded. Even their own footsteps felt muffled, as though the soil itself was absorbing every noise. It wasn't long before they realized they were far from any marked trail, surrounded by trees so dense they blotted out the afternoon light. Then, through the mist and the tangle of branches, one of them spotted it, a dark outline half buried in the ground, hidden beneath a curtain of ivy and rot. It wasn't a cave or an abandoned shed as they first thought, but an old cabin, tilted into the earth like it was sinking. The roof was caved in at one corner, and the windows were boarded from the inside. Moss grew thick across the logs, fusing the structure with the surrounding forest. A strange quiet surrounded it, too perfect and too heavy to feel natural. One of them joked about it being haunted, but no one laughed. They approached anyway, drawn by a mix of curiosity and unease. The door resisted when they pushed it, swollen with damp, and when it finally gave way, the smell that rolled out made them all step back. It was the odor of something long dead, something that had soaked into the wood over years. Inside, the air was thick and still. Dust floated through narrow beams of light that forced their way through cracks in the walls. Everything seemed frozen in time: old furniture, a shattered lantern, a rusted cradle. But what caught their eyes were the portraits. Dozens of framed photographs and charcoal sketches hung crookedly along the walls. Each one showed a family, generation after generation, but the faces didn't look right. The first few seemed normal enough, though pale and expressionless. Then, with each frame that followed, the faces began to change: eyes too large, noses missing, skin folded strangely, features blending into one another as if nature had forgotten how to shape them. One of the hikers whispered that it looked like the same bloodline repeating endlessly. Another pointed out that the final photograph, the one in the center, showed 7 figures whose faces were barely human at all. The silence in the room grew unbearable. They didn't notice the faint sound of movement from beneath the floorboards, the slow drag of something alive down below. It was the first sign that what they had uncovered was not forgotten by time, it had merely been waiting. Beneath the rotting floorboard, they found it by accident. One of the hikers, still shaken by the grotesque portraits, tried to steady himself against the wall and his boot pressed through a soft spot in the wooden floor. The sound was hollow, not like solid ground, but like something hidden underneath. Dust rose as he knelt down, scraping away at the warped planks until a section lifted free with a dull crack. Beneath it lay a compartment, shallow and damp, lined with decaying cloth and a nest of cobwebs. Inside, wrapped in layers of mildewed linen, was a thick leather-bound book. Its cover was darkened with age, warped by moisture, and the brass clasp that held it shut had nearly rusted away. The air around it felt heavier somehow, as if the moment it was exposed, the cabin itself exhaled after years of holding its breath. When they pried it open, the smell of old ink and decay poured out. The first few pages were brittle, filled with looping handwriting so small it almost looked like it was trying to hide. At first glance, it seemed like a family record: births, marriages, deaths, all written in meticulous order. The names repeated over and over, identical first and last names appearing in every generation. But the strange part was how the entries grew darker, more obsessive, as the years went on. The handwriting became uneven, smeared in places as if written with trembling hands. The earliest entries were ordinary enough, dated nearly 2 centuries ago, but the later ones were unsettling, accompanied by strange symbols drawn in the margins, sketches of faces that looked inhuman, and notes about purity of the line. Each generation appeared to have married within the same small circle, the same surnames reappearing again and again. What began as cousins joining through rural isolation evolved into something far more deliberate. The record detailed marriages between uncles and nieces, brothers and sisters, even between parents and their own children, all justified by cryptic phrases about keeping the gift intact. One entry stood out, written in a hurried scrawl: *the 7th will seal it. No outsiders. No dilution. The words were underlined twice, as if it were a command passed down rather than a statement. As they turned the final pages, they found photographs pressed between them, small, black and white images of the same families from the portraits on the walls. The faces were blurred, almost as though the film itself had melted around them. The last dated entry was from 70 years ago, its ink still faintly visible. The writer's final words read, *, the blood weakens, the flesh remembers, and the woods protect what's left. The group exchanged uneasy glances. The cabin wasn't just abandoned, it was a vault of a family's descent, recorded by their own hand and sealed beneath the floor for reasons that none of them yet understood. The deeper they examined the ledger, the more disturbing its implications became. The same names kept surfacing: Elias, Martha, Silas, Ruth, circling through every generation like echoes that refused to fade. At first, it seemed like a record of one isolated family's history, confined to this forgotten place. But when Claire, still uneasy, took a closer look at the later entries, something caught her eye. The dates didn't just stop decades ago as they had thought. The last few were written in a different ink, fresher, as though someone had touched the pages in more recent years. One entry from 1998 listed a birth with a familiar surname but a new first name: Daniel. Next to it was scrawled a location: Hollow Creek, West Virginia. Claire froze, realizing that Hollow Creek was less than 20 miles from their own hometown. That night, back at their campsite, the group searched the names online while their phones still had a faint signal. One by one, they found records, some old census data, others recent missing person reports. The surnames matched perfectly. A woman reported missing in 1973. A family that disappeared from a nearby county in 1989. A child who vanished from a foster home in 2007. Each shared a blood connection, an unbroken thread leading back to the same ancestral name written in that ledger. What unsettled them most was how official records had changed the spellings slightly over time, as if someone had tried to disguise the lineage but never fully succeeded. The realization struck like a slow, creeping sickness. The family recorded in that book hadn't died out. They had simply moved, changed names, and continued in secret. Somewhere, descendants of that grotesque bloodline were still alive, hiding in plain sight, marrying, reproducing, and perhaps even keeping the same twisted vow that began generations ago. Claire's unease grew into dread when she noticed one particular name among the missing persons list. Her great-grandmother's maiden name matched one in the ledger exactly. Her friends dismissed it as coincidence, but the more she stared at the looping handwriting on the page, the less she believed that. As the night deepened, the woods grew impossibly still. A faint sound echoed through the trees, something like distant laughter, or maybe weeping. The group tried to convince themselves it was just the wind, but the sound seemed to move, circling their camp in the dark. Claire kept the ledger close, unable to shake the feeling that the names inside weren't just memories, they were warnings. Those who bore them had vanished for a reason, and perhaps by finding this place, they had stirred something that had been waiting for its name to be spoken again. As night settled over the forest, a cold stillness crept through the trees, swallowing every trace of sound. The group had gathered around their dying fire, each lost in uneasy thoughts about the ledger and the twisted lineage it described. The forest was too quiet, no crickets, no rustle of small creatures, not even the soft sigh of the wind. The air felt thick, pressed down by something unseen, as if the entire woods were holding its breath. Then, somewhere beyond the flickering light, they heard it, a low, drawn-out murmur, faint but unmistakably human. It came and went like a breath, rising between the trees before fading again into silence. They froze, straining their ears, but the whisper did not return right away. When it did, it was closer. At first, they thought it might be the echo of their own voices. The forest had strange acoustics, they reasoned. But the words that slipped through the dark weren't random. They carried tone, rhythm, and intention. Claire was the first to notice what none of them wanted to believe: the whisper had said her name. It wasn't loud, not even clear, but the sound was undeniable. It came again, drifting through the cold air, this time nearer to the edge of their camp, soft and drawn out, her name bending as though it was being dragged through something wet. The others tried to reassure her, telling her it was just the wind. Yet one by one, they began hearing their own names whispered, each in the same eerie tone, as if spoken by someone who had known them all their lives. The fire crackled weakly, its orange light revealing nothing but trees. When one of the hikers shone a flashlight into the woods, the beam caught nothing but the endless maze of trunks and shadows. Still, the whispers grew more insistent, overlapping now, layers of soft voices speaking all at once, too fast to understand but filled with a strange rhythm that felt almost ritualistic. Every so often, one voice would rise above the rest, calm, deep, and impossibly close. They huddled tighter together, watching the darkness breathe just beyond their reach. The whispers began circling them, moving from one side to the other. The sound was no longer coming from a single direction, it surrounded them, sinking into the soil, threading through the trees. Claire's flashlight flickered and went dark, and in that instant, the voices stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep within the forest, came the sound of wood creaking, slow, deliberate, and heavy as though a door had opened. It was the same kind of sound they had heard earlier, in the cabin, when something had shifted beneath the floorboards. By morning, the whispers had faded, but their echo lingered in every rustle of leaves. None of the hikers had truly slept. Their nerves were frayed, their eyes sunken with exhaustion, yet something stronger than fear drove them forward, a need to understand what they had found. Following an overgrown trail behind the cabin, they stumbled upon a narrow path barely visible beneath the underbrush. It seemed to wind with purpose, as though it had once been walked often but had long since been reclaimed by the forest. The air grew colder as they followed it, and the scent of damp soil thickened with each step. Then, through the trees, they saw it, a house, if it could still be called that. The structure was older than the cabin, built of stone and decayed wood. Its roof sagged inward, its windows shattered and patched with rags. An unnatural stillness surrounded it, broken only by the distant croak of crows. The group hesitated at the tree line, sensing something alive inside. When they finally approached, the front door creaked open before they could touch it. A figure stood in the doorway, cloaked in shadows. At first, they couldn't tell if it was man or woman. The body was frail, bent, wrapped in layers of filthy cloth. When the figure stepped into the light, their faces turned pale. The person's features were wrong, skin puckered and uneven, one side drooping as though melted, the other pulled tight. The eyes were milky white, blind but aware, and the mouth quivered with silent effort before releasing a sound that was neither greeting nor threat, a low, rasping hum that vibrated through the air. The figure turned and motioned for them to follow. Against their better judgment, they did. Inside, the air smelled of rot and candle wax. Strange objects hung from the ceiling: bones, feathers, bits of fabric. The walls were lined with jars containing what looked like preserved remains of animals, though some shapes inside didn't resemble animals at all. The blind figure moved with a slow, deliberate grace, stopping near a mound of earth at the center of the room. It was not part of the floor but a patch of disturbed soil, as though something or someone was buried there. When Claire asked who they were, the figure tilted their head, lips trembling into a broken smile. They whispered a name that matched one from the ledger, a name that had appeared 7 generations down the bloodline. Their voice was soft but filled with conviction as they spoke of the duty to protect what lay beneath the earth. Their sightless eyes turned toward Claire, as if they could see her. They reached out a twisted hand and said quietly, "The blood remembers its own." Behind the decaying farmhouse, the hikers found a narrow clearing where the trees thinned just enough to let in pale strips of sunlight. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of mud and iron. At the far end of the clearing stood a stone structure that didn't belong to the forest. It was circular and built from weathered, hand-cut rocks, each one stained dark with time. Chains, thick and rusted, crossed over the top of it in a crisscross pattern, held in place by iron spikes driven deep into the stone. A faint trickle of water could be heard below, but it wasn't steady, it pulsed, like a heartbeat buried in the ground. When one of them brushed the moss from its edge, the engraved letters came into view, *the well of the 7th. The blind figure they had met earlier refused to come near it. They stood at a distance, shaking their head and mumbling words that sounded more like prayer than warning. Claire felt drawn toward it despite the unease twisting in her stomach. The well looked ancient, older than the farmhouse and older, perhaps, than the family itself. Around its base were carved symbols, crude shapes that might have been letters once, but had eroded into strange, looping marks. Some looked freshly cut, as if someone had come here recently to renew them. The chains were not decoration. They had been welded together in places, as if someone wanted to make absolutely sure that whatever was inside could never be opened. But curiosity overpowered caution. One of the hikers, a man named Mark, leaned closer to peer through a small gap between the chains. The air that rose from within was cold enough to sting his skin, carrying a scent that made his throat tighten, a mix of wet soil, rot, and something faintly metallic. He jerked back, gagging, and swore he had seen movement below, like a ripple of flesh in the dark water. Claire asked the old figure why the well was sealed. The answer came in a trembling whisper, because that's where they ended it. The 7th turned inward. None of them understood what it meant, but the phrase repeated itself in their heads long after. The air around the well seemed to hum softly, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Even standing near it made their chests feel heavy, as if the forest itself was pressing down on them. Before they left, Claire noticed something strange, small footprints in the mud near the base of the well, far too small to belong to any of them. They led out of the forest and disappeared into the trees. She called out, but no one answered. Only the soft pulse of the well replied, echoing in the silence like something alive, waiting beneath the surface for the chains to fail. When the group returned to the well the following evening, a thick fog had settled over the clearing, blurring the shapes of the trees into grey silhouettes. The air was colder than before, and every breath came out in pale wisps that hung low to the ground. The old blind figure was gone, leaving behind only a trail of disturbed soil leading back toward the farmhouse. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the slow creak of the chains as they shifted against the stone, moved by a wind that wasn't there. Claire felt something inside her whisper that the well wasn't meant to be left alone. The others argued, wanting to leave it untouched, but curiosity, fear, and the sense that something unfinished lay beneath drove them closer. Mark, the most defiant of the group, was the first to act. He picked up a rusted crowbar from the farmhouse and wedged it between 2 links of the chain. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the clearing, sharp and shrill. Each strike seemed to stir the air, and soon the wind picked up, not natural wind, but a deep, vibrating rush that came from below the earth. One by one, the chains snapped loose, until the last one fell away with a dull clang. The moment it hit the ground, the stench burst forth like a living thing. It was overpowering, a foul, suffocating odor of decay and stagnant water mixed with something indescribably wrong. They all stepped back, gagging, but Mark leaned over the edge with his flashlight, shining it into the depths. The beam didn't travel far before it met a wall of thick, shifting darkness. Then something moved. It wasn't just the water, it was something beneath it, writhing slowly, the light catching glimpses of shapes that didn't make sense, fragments of bone, lengths of twisted spine, faces half-formed and melted together as if mold from wax and flesh. The well wasn't filled with water at all but with layers of remains, soaked and fused into one another over years. Claire screamed for Mark to move away, but before he could react, a low groan rose from deep within the well. It was not mechanical or human, it was a sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. The trees around them began to tremble, and the earth shifted under their feet. Mark stumbled back, his flashlight dropping into the darkness below. It vanished without a splash. The clearing fell silent again, but the stench remained, thicker than before. Claire thought she saw something just beneath the surface, a pale hand drifting upward, before the fog swallowed the well completely, sealing it once more in its ancient breath of rot and silence. As they staggered away from the well, choking on the stench, Claire clutched the ledger to her chest. She felt that the answers were buried within those brittle pages, the same ones they had pried from beneath the cabin floor. When they returned to the farmhouse, the air inside had changed. Candles that had been extinguished earlier now flickered faintly, though no one had lit them. The light revealed faint symbols etched into the wooden walls, circles, lines, and spirals repeating in uneven patterns. Some were drawn in faded chalk, others in something darker that had long since dried to a rusty brown. Claire laid the ledger on a table, its leather cover damp with the cold air, and began to turn the pages again. Hidden between the older records, pressed flat between two blank sheets, they found fragments of another document, letters and journal entries, written by the same hand that had chronicled the family's generations. The words were trembling but determined, filled with a kind of religious fervor. The writer spoke of the patriarch, the first man who began the bloodline, describing him as a visionary who believed that purity of flesh would grant them power beyond mortality. He was convinced that by keeping the blood untainted, the family would transcend sickness, decay, and death itself. What he could not understand was that nature resists perfection when forced upon it. The pursuit of purity had twisted their forms and minds, generation after generation, until the very essence of their humanity had decayed. The letters grew darker with time. One spoke of a gift, something passed down through the eldest child, though the description blurred the line between blessing and curse. Another page contained a desperate plea for forgiveness, written by a descendant who confessed that the family had gone too far. They spoke of births that should never have been, children who did not cry or breathe but still lived somehow, hidden away in the house until the night swallowed them. The entries described how the family had sealed the source beneath the well to stop the sickness from spreading further. The phrase "the seventh will seal it" appeared again, suggesting that the bloodline's final generation was tasked with burying what their ancestors had created. Claire's hands trembled as she realized that the vow of purity was never about faith or tradition, it was fear. The family had tried to contain the horror their obsession had birthed, binding it in stone and chain, believing the land itself could keep it quiet. But something had changed when they broke the seal. The pact was undone, and the same madness that consumed those who came before was awakening again in the blood that still remained. The revelation hit like a cold wave when Claire began connecting the details scattered through the ledger, the photographs, and the whispered names that had followed them since the night they entered the woods. The handwriting on the final pages, once belonging to the last recorded generation, felt strangely familiar. Certain letters curved in the same way Claire's own did. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, a trick of the mind brought on by fear, but the thought refused to fade. When she compared the family portraits with her own childhood photo tucked in her wallet, the resemblance was undeniable, the same faint scar above the left brow, the same curve of the mouth. It was as though one of the faces from those aged photographs had been reborn in her. The others tried to reassure her, insisting that fear was distorting her perception, but the evidence was too clear to ignore. Every name in the ledger tied back to families who had vanished, and through each generation, one female descendant had survived long enough to continue the bloodline before retreating back into isolation. Claire realized she was not just an intruder here, she was the reason the forest had drawn them in. The whispers had not been calling random names that night, they had been calling her home. As the realization set in, her surroundings seemed to respond. The air in the farmhouse grew thick, almost pulsing, and the sound of something shifting beneath the floor returned, slow, deliberate, and rhythmic, as if echoing her heartbeat. The others began arguing, panicked and desperate to leave, but Claire felt an unexplainable pull toward the well outside. The blind figure's words echoed in her mind, *, the blood remembers its own. She began to understand that the forest wasn't haunted in the traditional sense, it was alive with memory, and her blood was part of that memory. Mark grabbed her arm, trying to drag her toward the trail, but she felt her body resist. Her skin tingled, and her pulse quickened in a way that didn't feel like fear. Something deep inside her stirred a recognition, an instinct older than logic. The whispers began again, softer this time, coming not from the trees but from within her mind, guiding her back to the clearing. The others shouted after her, but their voices grew distant, muffled by the sound of rustling leaves. The forest no longer seemed hostile, it felt familiar, protective even, as if it had been waiting for her return. By the time she reached the edge of the well, the wind had stopped entirely, and the air was still. The chains lay broken, the surface dark and smooth. In her reflection, she didn't see herself, she saw the faces of all who came before, watching her, waiting for her to continue what they began. The forest seemed to exhale when dawn finally crept through the trees, but the light did little to chase away the darkness that had settled within it. Mist clung to the ground like a living thing, winding between roots and stones, curling around the broken farmhouse and the well that now stood open to the morning air. The hikers were gone. No footsteps marked the damp soil, no gear or trail of escape suggested their departure. Only silence remained, thick, absolute, and unnatural. The birds did not return with the sunrise, and the wind refused to move. The forest had swallowed everything whole, leaving no sign that anyone had ever stepped within its borders. The locals who lived miles away spoke later of hearing strange echoes that morning, cries that sounded like names carried on the wind, fading before they could be understood. When a search party was eventually sent into the woods, they found the cabin exactly as it had been described in old legends, sunken into the earth, filled with dust and portraits of distorted faces staring out through cracked glass. But there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints, only the faint smell of decay and the echo of something that might have been laughter lingering in the air. The ledger lay on the table, open to a blank page, though the ink from previous entries had smudged across it as if freshly touched. The well was found too, but the chains were gone. The mouth of it was covered again, this time not with metal but with soil and roots that seemed to have grown overnight, sealing it completely. When one of the men tried to dig at the edges, the ground bled a thick, dark moisture that smelled faintly of iron and rot. The older members of the search team refused to touch it, muttering that some things were better left buried. They returned before dusk, shaken but unwilling to say why. Weeks passed, and the forest returned to its eerie stillness. No one ventured there again. The cabin, the farmhouse, and even the clearing slowly disappeared beneath creeping vines and moss, as though the woods were reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. Yet those who lived nearby began reporting strange sounds on quiet nights, the faint murmur of voices calling softly from the trees, the sound of footsteps circling their homes though no one was there. Some claimed to see figures standing at the forest's edge, faces half hidden but familiar, as if reflected from an old photograph. The land was silent by day, but by night, it remembered, and it waited for the next name in the bloodline to hear its call.